So the British Quilt Study Group is one of the specialist groups of the Quilters Guild. It was formed in 1998, but its roots are right back at the very beginning of the Guild. So the formation of the Guild at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. And that's because the earliest sort of pioneers for the Guild were people who were interested in capturing the history of our country's quilting, but also how we applied that to new and exciting work. And that's really the principle of the British Quilt Study Group going forward. It's a really unique meld of old and new, so learning about quilts of the past, but also researching and capturing information about the quilt trends that affect us all now. BQSG really isn't just for experts. People sometimes have that preconceived notion. I think because we publish a journal and it's an academic journal, that can sometimes give the impression that it's for people who, want to do that kind of research. But the reality is that most of our members are people who are just interested in quilts and interested in quilt stories. I think if you're somebody who's interested in the background of why quilts were made and what they were made for, who they were given to, how they were kept in families, the history of fabrics moving around the globe and different trends and ideas. So if you're interested in any of those things, then you'd be a great BQSG member. The other preconception people have about BQSG is that it's just about old quilts. And I think it's really important to dispel that myth, The people who are interested in quilt stories are as interested in the stories about how quilts sit within the wider world. So how they sit amongst, political activism, environmental activism, the history of feminism. Quilts are part of the kind of social history of our country. And so writing about all the things that affect quilt making now will be a resource in the future. So it's really important that we also have members who are interested in those sorts of movements, what they're seeing happening around the world in terms of how people are responding to things like environmental concerns with their quilt making or, social justice campaigns. We need people to be writing about those things now so that in 20 years' time or 40 years' time, when people look back on things like the Quilt Studies Journal, they'll be able to understand what were the motivations for the quilt makers making things today. The work that British Quilt Study Group does is really important because the output of people's research and discussions are papers that are published, and those published papers go into places like the British Museum and university libraries, and that captures, in print the history of our quilting nation, and it gets used by all sorts of different people, from museum curators to textile historians to historians writing about the social history of women's lives and family lives, domestic life. Quilting is not this sort of thing that lives separately from everything else. It was a part of people's everyday lives. And the more that we can uncover and learn and put into context what we know about why quilts were made and where they were made and who made them, the more by association we learn about the people who made them and the lives that they lived. And very often, these are histories that traditional history never captured. So it's about, women, it's about domesticity, it's about the home. But all of these things are really important that we capture those. And so that's a lot of the work is around putting quilts into their context. People don't realise that a lot of what we know about British quilting history comes from the British Quilt Study Group. So the women who did a lot of the early work captured a lot of stories at a time when people really weren't interested in women's history in the same way. And so we really owe them a massive debt of gratitude. And all of the work that the British Quilt Study Group has done since then really builds on their work. So for new members, it's a great group to be involved in. It's a really eclectic group, so it's not really about having one particular interest or one particular perspective. There's everybody there, from people who are interested in, museum quilts through to people who are just interested in like their local social history, or maybe even things like genealogy. If you've traced your family tree, then you're probably going to be interested in the kinds of things that we talk about in the British Quilt Study Group. Although alongside looking at historical quilts, which obviously is a big part of what we do, we also try and capture a lot of the kind of modern quilt trends. Being a member of BQSG, we have a newsletter. So that's a digital newsletter that comes out 2 or 3 times a year. And you'll get that in, just email in your inbox, or some people choose to have it delivered by paper. But then the big deliverable during the year is a journal. So this is a published journal called Quilt Studies. We've been publishing that for, I think it's something like 20 years now. And that journal is a roundup of all of the research that's been presented that year at an event called the BQSG Conference. The BQSG Conference is a lovely event, so it happens in different places around the country, normally associated with a museum or somewhere where there's a collection. We normally get sort of privileged access into the collection, so the curator will show us around and show us some of the treasures. It's a bit like behind the scenes at the museum, so if you like that kind of thing, you'll love this. And then at that conference, there's normally a weekend of people presenting papers, so people who have researched papers and want to share them with the group, and then discussions about that afterwards. Plus there's always a really lovely show and tell. So some of our members are quilt collectors, and so they'll bring along old quilts. Lots of our members are just, ordinary quilters who maybe have a quilt in their family, and that's a big reason for people to join. So either a quilt that they own, they've inherited, or maybe there's just a really intriguing quilt in their local museum that they're interested in and they'd like to know more about. Very often people think that, all of the significant quilts have been found, but they really haven't. There are lots of quilts in people's attics and in people's, nana's bedroom. And, we still need to kind of learn the histories of those sorts of things. So there's all sorts. I mean, lots of people do think that the Quilt Study Group is sort of an expert forum. And there are people who, research and present papers and publish papers. And that's very much like an academic undertaking. But there's lots of other people who just, we're just really interested in quilts. I think if you're interested in quilts and you're interested in quilters, the makers of quilts, who made them and why they made them and who they made them for, then this is the forum for you. There's also a bursary, which is something I'm really pleased about this year. So, sometimes the costs involved in researching something can be prohibitive for people. And so you'll be able to apply for this bursary. It's a £500 bursary. And that will, hopefully bring lots more people who are interested in getting involved in this area into the group. There are lots of quilts in the Quilters Guild collection where Heather is looking for help to research some of these quilts. And, often BQSG members are the people who can offer help with that sort of work as well. For example, this lovely quilt, which is a quilt by a lady called Agnes Bentham. And this is a quilt that I did some work on recently, which was just really nice. We had some information from her birth certificate and the census returns, but from that I was able to kind of uncover a really interesting story about her life. And this is somebody who was, a working class girl doing workaday jobs, working as a servant and caring for her family, for her father after her mother died. And so these are the stories that we probably would never have told, but being able to access this sort of information enables us to bring these people to life. And that's really valuable for the Quilters Guild collection because it offers another resource of people who are interested and passionate about these quilts and passionate about telling the stories that sit behind them.
The British Quilt Study Group is one of 5 varied special interest groups available for Guild members to join. Visit our website at quiltersguild.org.uk to find out more.